Welcome back, Hnrs. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your first flip for me being back in the United States. All right, so getting back into it, y'all did a great job today in class. I know I was having a conversation with Katie at the end of class where it was like, man, did we really go through that much nose stuff? Well, it takes a long time to tell it takes a long time to tell myths and do things like that and go over those different content perspectives, but I'm really glad we started moving into the Mycenaeans today, right? So we will talk about another myth that actually has to do with Mycenaeans as well. Probably not in this flip, but during class as well, because you probably heard it before. It has to do with Agamemnon and Menelaus and stuff like that. But where we left off in class, we were talking about this guy, speaking of Agamemnon, right? This right here was the gold mask of Agamemnon that was discovered in a shaft grave in Mycenae, dating back to some of the earliest foundings of their entire civilization. Now, big thing about this mask, okay? So it is attributed to being the mask of Agamemnon, who was a mythical figure from Greek myth and mythology, from the Iliad and the Odyssey, and he is supposed to be the king of the Mycenaeans, right? He is the king of the Mycenaeans, and then when this mask was discovered, there was a German archaeologist that discovered it and was like, oh, this must be the mask of Agamemnon, right? Yeah, we don't have any real way to prove that. We just are mainly saying that because of its ornamentation, and it's also very, very deep detail and things like that for an ancient society. But the big thing about it is that the Mask of Agamemnon does help us kind of look at a couple of different things. I remember during class I looked over and like Kelsey was just kind of laughing and stuff like that because this is not the best piece of artwork ever seen, right? Like the thing about it is it's very representative of the shaft grave era due to the fact that this time period in Mycenaean history, the first of their two time periods or phases, is going to demonstrate to us that they were an early civilization, learning how to adapt, learning their own culture, and learning how to actually become more complex, right? Also demonstrated in the shaft graves themselves. It's just a really, really deep hole with a stone coffin at the bottom, right? Audrey was like, man, that's a really deep hole. Yeah, yeah, it's a very, very deep hole, and it literally is going to help preserve so many of those items down there at the very bottom of the shaft grave. But looking at some of their other items as well, they had simple bronze swords, they had some small pieces of art, and they also, these are very, very famous, boar tusk lined helmets that were found at the bottom of some of these shaft graves as well. So what those are helmets that Mycenaean soldiers or warriors would wear, and they actually had tusks that lined the outside of them from wild boars, right? Now, what does this demonstrate to us? What do all these items demonstrate to us? Well, first of all, that they're a fledgling civilization during this time period, and they're kind of coming around to finding themselves and understanding themselves. We are seeing no signs of art or extreme art or written systems. And what we're looking at with this boar tusk helmet, right? With these simple bronze swords, with these the kind of pieces of art, with this mask of Agamemnon, maybe we have a militaristic society on our hands, right? That's a really big thing you need to understand, okay? So at the earliest phases during the shaft grave era, we believe that we can see the foundations of the Mycenaean civilization being a little bit more militaristic, possibly a little bit more army and military and warrior style heavy, and then we're also seeing just a simple civilization that is growing and being founded on Peloponnese. But then all of a sudden, we see a dramatic shift into this thing called the Quine Era, which Quine in Greek means common, or what I like to refer to as the Beehive Era, right? So the thing about it is you all of a sudden see right around, give or take, 1000 BC, right close to 1200 BC, you see a jump in the Mycenaean civilization from being a simple militaristic society to being an intelligent militaristic society, right? So during the Quine or Common Era, or the Beehive Burial period era, we see the Mycenaeans jump forward in an expansive amount of intelligence, right? The Mycenaeans all of a sudden started producing frescoes. Wait a minute, I thought that was just a Minoan thing. I know, Megan Wolf, give me a second. So, the big thing about it is, we start seeing Mycenaean frescoes. We start seeing, armor that was left behind in these areas that is no longer made of boar tusks, but instead lined with bronze, right? So we're seeing the expansion of intricate military systems and the expansion of this militaristic society in their entire area. We also can see the expansion of the Mycenaeans themselves. See the pink right here? That is where the Mycenaeans are going to begin to grow, and during their Beehive or Quine era, we're going to see the fall of the Minoan civilization. So maybe that tells us that the Mycenaeans during their Quine or Common Era showed up and took them over. As we can tell from looking at this, also, we see a dramatic development in the way that they bury their bodies, right? The Beehive Burial system is adopted in the Mycenaean civilization for burying royals and leaders, right? Now, granted, the shaft grave era was also used to bury royals and leaders as well, but the thing about it that you need to understand is in the Beehive Burial period, it's not just a simple, really, really deep hole. It is now actually being dug into the side of a hill and having an internal cavern dug out, which would then be lined with stones and bricks. The body would be placed right here, and items would be placed around it where priests and other sacrificial practices, they could come inside and actually continue to see and adorn the body with things like that. And it's also, look at this thing. They've survived thousands of years, right? Thousands of years, and they're very intricate burial systems. I think I've said the word intricate like 18 times. But the thing about it is, it's like the word of the day. Now, the big thing about it is that actually looking at this entire system, we're seeing a dramatic leap forward in the intelligence of the Mycenaean people. We're seeing a solidification of their militaristic style. We're seeing an expansion of them as an empire, and we're seeing the birth of a dominant power in ancient Greece, right? So, now granted, we're still not going to be calling them Greek quite yet, because they still don't do things that are kind of stereotypically Greek, but they are the foundations of modern Greek society. The interesting thing about it is it's kind of like when you talk about the Minoans and the Athenians and how they had a myth about the Minoans, maybe the Minoans had some kind of cultural influence on the Athenians in their early foundings, and then you see the Mycenaeans and their militaristic style, maybe the Mycenaeans had some like actual militaristic founding influence on the Spartans as well, right? So we're seeing these two large societies pop up, right? And the Mycenaeans do all these different things so well, and these artifacts tell us so much. They tell us a big thing, that they are a culture that values war, right? They are a culture that actually values the expansion of their empire. They're a culture that actually believes in building up a strong military, and we can see this as well in their city stronghold, right? We talked about this yesterday in class. I think I got a laugh or something like that out of Brianna at one point, and I was just like, oh, the Minoans created Knossos, and the Mycenaeans were like, we're the Mycenaeans, and this is our city. It's called Mycenaean, right? So, like, in their city stronghold was very, very large, and also developed in a very different way than Knossos ever was, right? Because when we're looking at this entire area, like, we're looking at a very complex city that has a massive wall around the outside of it, right? So right here is the grave circle. That's where the shaft graves were actually found. Later on, the Beehive Burial centers would actually be like further out into the countryside and stuff like that. But this main city stronghold area of the Mycenaeans was replete with a citadel, or this area that was raised up higher on the ground. Just keep that in mind. It's higher up on the ground. We saw like primitive religious systems, and we also saw this really important thing, the Lion's Gate, right? So this is a really important element of Mycenaean architecture in their culture as well. They had a fortified wall that went all the way around their entire city, and in their city, there was one entrance and exit, and it was known as the Lion's Gate. What does this fortified city and this hard to enter and easy to defend city tell us about the Mycenaeans? Maybe they are militaristic, but it also tells us that they're trying to protect themselves from being attacked, right? Which means that they might have been going to war with other states in different, like for different reasons and over different eras of their entire history. Now, looking at the Minoans, though, what about the Minoans? If we were to jump all the way back to Knossos real quick and take a gander at that, Knossos does not, oh, wait, that's Crete. Knossos does not look like the Mycenaean at all. There is no wall around Knossos, right? There is no, like, really fortified centers to protect them from attack and things like that. So the Minoans might have actually depended on their boats and their navy and never actually depended on a fortified city quite like the Mycenaeans did, right? And so it intrinsically tells us there's a massive difference between the Mycenaeans and the Minoans, but we also do know the Mycenaeans came after the Minoans, so maybe it's a very good chance that they actually took them over, right? So going forward as well, we also begin during the Quine Era and the Beehive Burial period to see a development in Mycenaean writing, right? We're starting to see a development in Mycenaean writing, and their writing system is going to be known as Linear B, right? Linear A being the Minoan one from the Phaistos that we cannot translate, and Linear B being the one that actually turns out fragments of it are decipherable, right? We can read bits and pieces of Linear B, and we know that it is the foundation of the modern Greek language, right? So we're looking at this like a piece of, oh wait, go back. This piece of Linear B right here, you can see some symbol characters that are actually going to be used and adopted from the Phoenicians during their trade exports, and then also that are going to be the foundations for some of the symbols in ancient Greek, okay? Now going forward though, we also see a dramatic period during the Quine Era of the Mycenaeans where they also focus on conquest, right? They focus on expanding over modern-day Greece and creating a very, very large military where they're at it, right? And they end up doing this at a time when there are other very large societies with very large militaries existing at the exact same time, right? You need to understand going forward that the Mycenaeans were not the only ones out there, right? The Mycenaeans were not the only ones out there getting bigger, expanding, taking over the Minoans, growing a very large military, and also looking to push their influence throughout the Aegean, the Ionian, and parts of the Mediterranean Sea, right? Because as we already know from taking your first map quiz, I'm going to try to put in today, actually, as well, we already know from looking at your first map quiz that the Mediterranean had a huge amount of civilizations that went all the way around the outside of it, but particularly the eastern corridor of the Mediterranean Sea had Mesopotamia, the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Egyptians, the Hebrews, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Persians, right? All these other different figures. Well, during this time period, the Persians weren't very large yet. They were just starting their early foundings. The Hittites were, though, pretty large and intense. You also had the New Kingdom Egyptians that actually existed during this time period as well. So the big thing about it, though, going on to it, that is a large group of people that the Mycenaeans are contending with. So that means that maybe this militaristic style is going to help them, and maybe there's going to be some rivalries that are going to pop up between the Mycenaeans and some of these other different figures. Now, the Hittites, as we remember, are going to take over the New Kingdom Egyptians a little bit later on because of their ironworking and things like that. But we also know that the Mycenaeans are going to push their influence over all these early Greek settlements, taking over the Palace of Knossos and also establishing some new palaces and city areas in different areas throughout all of Greece, right? Now, going forward, though, this militaristic style made a huge impact on later Greeks as well when it came to the writing of their myths, right? The myths that related to the Mycenaeans are a lot like the myths that relate to the Minoans. It gives us a lens into the ancient society of the Mycenaeans in a way that we couldn't otherwise do, right? So the myth that relates to the Mycenaeans, though, more than anything else, are two of them that actually popped up 700 years after the Mycenaeans had already fallen, or after the event that I was actually described in the myths themselves, right? And they're myths known as the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? And those two myths relate to one central event in Mycenaean history that we believe really kind of defines them as a civilization, right? And it's this event known as the Trojan War, right? The Trojan War relates to the Mycenaeans' fight against this city-state right there, the city-state of Troy. Now, paying attention to where Troy was located, right, here on the western coast of what is now modern-day Turkey, and seeing all these different islands and the areas that the Mycenaeans had taken over, Troy most likely relied on trade, right? And we know that this large war that broke out between the Mycenaeans and the Trojans might have actually gone because of trade. Now, we also have seen some different items, like written in Linear B, and then some other different items as well, that the actual real-life cause might have been caused by a rivalry between the two of them because Troy might have allied with the Hittites instead of allying with the Mycenaeans, and the Mycenaeans felt pushed aside, and we believe that this war was actually over some different trade routes and things like that through the Aegean, right? Now, also a really big thing, though, as well, is that we actually have the site, or discovered what we believe, the site of ancient Troy, right? So you can actually see this one right here, ancient Troy site. So, and it's actually located, again, right near, it's in Turkey, it's right below their modern-day capital of Istanbul, right? And so looking at this, we believe that we have seen in northwest Turkey different remnants and pieces left over of a large city that we believe was ancient Troy. But the issue is that not much of it is left, and there is definite signs of destruction at some period, so we believe that there's a very good chance that the Mycenaeans came in real life and actually did destroy the city-state of Troy. And I know some of y'all are having flashbacks to Miss Ursula's class right now going like, whoa, we talked about this in the Miss Ursula's class. We talked about Agamemnon and Menelaus. Yes, right? Those guys are related to the Iliad. And so is this very, very famous figure, the famous warrior known as Achilles, right? So and we'll talk a little bit about this entire myth and stuff like that. We'll talk about the myth of the Iliad. We'll focus on that one in particular because it actually directly relates to the Mycenaeans. And we'll talk about Helen of Troy, the woman that apparently was so beautiful that her face launched 1,000 ships, right? And we'll talk about all that stuff, right? But we do know that the Mycenaeans and Trojans, Mycenaeans and Trojans, that's not right. The Mycenaeans besieged Troy and destroyed it, right? This is a huge, important event. The Trojan War is not only going to define the culture of the Greeks, it's also going to define the culture of the Romans, because the Romans later on are going to kind of co-opt this event into their understanding of their faith and also of their founder, and they're going to believe that a man by the name of Aeneas, who is fleeing Troy as a Trojan soldier when it's being burned down by the Mycenaeans, would then eventually run off and go found Troy. Now, this doesn't come until much, much later in the Trojan society, because I'm sure that you've also heard of the earliest founding story about Rome, which has to do with these two brothers and a wolf, right? And we'll talk about that one as well. But the Trojan War is a central focal point in a mythic cycle that actually kind of ties together many ancient civilizations, right? And of course, we all know about the famous scene with the old horse, right? Like, so we'll talk about the horse here in a little bit and stuff like that. And also, there's a very famous scene from this movie with the horse in it.
Zeus on 3! 1!
Sherman, I absolutely forbid you to fight in the Trojan War.
That's not fair. All my friends are fighting in the Trojan War.
2!
Sherman, it's dangerous.
I'm wearing a helmet.
3!
You're not going.
Oh, yes, I am.
Zeus!
I know, right? Mr. Peabody and Sherman, a lot of people big fans, right? So now, but then, just like the Minoans, we're going to see something interesting happen to the Mycenaeans. And in a massive event known as the Bronze Age collapse occurred, right? So looking at the Greek time periods, you can draw this down, you can draw it if you feel like or whatever, we see a cataclysmic fall of not only the Mycenaeans, but also of all the other people that they were fighting against during their time period, right? We looked at that map that had all the colors on it, right? We saw Mycenaeans, we saw New Kingdom Egyptians, we saw the Hittites, we saw early Persians, we saw like little baby Assyrians that were left over and stuff like that. Looking at those different empires, most of them were hitting a very high peak right around this area. And then all of a sudden, something happened right here that is commonly referred to as the Bronze Age collapse, right? Reason why we call it the Bronze Age collapse is because for the very first 4 time periods of ancient Egypt, bronze was being used much more heavily than another one known as iron, all right? And we'll talk about that in about 2 seconds. But here's the thing. Do we know what happened right here in this central focal point event? Unfortunately, no. We have no idea what happened right here that actually caused the fall of the Mycenaeans, the fall of the Hittites, or a stepping back of the Hittites, the fall of the New Kingdom Egyptians, the fall of all these different figures, and they're going down throughout history, right? Which would open the doorway for other people like the Hebrews and the Egyptians, or the Phoenicians and people like that a little bit later on. But the Mycenaeans, the Egyptians, the Hittites, everybody else saw widespread destruction and also large economic falls. This could have been due to natural disasters, trade disruptions, migrations and movements by new groups of people that we're not sure about. But the thing about it that we do know is that the smelting and making of bronze pretty much heavily ended right here. And then we saw a new growth of Western civilizations on the other side, going from ancient Greeks, Dark Ages, and forward to the development of the smelting of iron, right? So the Iron Age is going to become very, very important going forward as well, right? And like I said, we don't know specifically what happened, but as you can see from this map and all these different fires and destructive like areas that are actually all over this place, we don't really know what went down because all these question marks, we think that maybe that there was this like massive, like the leading and prevailing idea is that a huge new group of nomadic barbarians started invading all these different areas and overwhelmed some of the earliest areas, right? And they're going to overwhelm some of these areas like ancient Egypt and the Hittites and the Assyrians and going to lead to their downfall as a society. And it's going to lead to this thing as known as the Bronze Age collapse, right? Now, once the Bronze Age collapse occurs and the Mycenaeans fall, again, due to who knows why, right? We then enter into what's known as the Greek Dark Ages, right? Now, the ancient Greek Dark Ages are defined as a very bad time, right? The thing about a Dark Age is a Dark Age is usually used to define a very bad time in the progression of art, that there is no writing, that population declines when throughout history, population almost always increases, right? That it's a large period of famine, that it's just a very terrible time. It's almost like what happened was the Mycenaeans fell and then everyone who was in Greece had to hit the reset button and start all over again, right? They had to relearn how to farm. They had to relearn how to make art. Like, look at this crusty thing. This is a sculpture from the Dark Ages in ancient Greece called the Centaur. This thing is crusty by comparison to the Minoans and the Mycenaean frescoes, right? To the Beehive Burial chambers, to the Mask of Agamemnon. I can make that. The thing about it is the only interesting thing that happened during the Dark Ages period, well, there's a couple of interesting things that happened during the Dark Ages period, but the one major interesting thing that happened during the Dark Ages period is that ironworking began to develop, right? We saw the development of using and smelting iron, which holds an edge for longer, doesn't rust as bad, and all these other different things going on with it. Ironworking becomes a much more developed practice during this era, which demonstrates that, at least one thing advanced a little bit. They're not using bronze anymore, but they're also, they're using iron, which is much better, but they're also not making art and everything's bad and it really, really stinks and no one can read. The thing about it, though, in general, is that the Mycenaeans, we do believe, though, during this time period, were replaced or invaded by a barbaric group of people known as the Dorians, right? And I'm going to say that name again, the Dorians. I'm going to say it upside down, the Dorians. I'm going to say it, all over the place, the Dorians, right? So the Dorians is very, very, very important, right? I'm going to even say it in slow motion. They're so freaking important, okay? But these people known as the Dorians came in, and they basically replaced all the major Mycenaeans, so trade areas and civilizations following the Bronze Age collapse, right? And they are some of the only surviving history, even though, ironically enough, history I'm using in a very relative sense, right? Because we believe during the Dorian invasion, and as the Dorians began making bad art and having famines and having population decline, and basically hitting the reset button on all of Greek civilization, the only surviving evidence of this time period comes from a person that we would believe would be more Dorian than Greek or whatever, because here's the other thing too. The Dorians called themselves Hnrs, right? Which actually in modern Greek means Greek, right? So now, some of the only surviving history that we have is from this blind poet that apparently wandered around during Dark Ages Greece and wrote the famous stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? Now, here's the other weird thing about this blind poet named Homer. Apparently, when he wrote, quote-unquote, the Iliad and the Odyssey, he did this during the Dark Ages period of Greece where no one knew how to read or write. So, of course, now he's blind, right? If you go to Barnes & Noble and buy a copy of the Iliad, if you go and buy a copy of the Odyssey, it says it's by Homer on that book. We don't even know if this guy was real. It's pretty subjective that he was real at all. We think that there's a very good chance that he wasn't real and that Homer just became an idea or a personified idea that people began talking about and stuff like that, being oh, I think that guy Homer came up with this. Because according to ancient Greek lore, Homer was a blind poet that wandered around ancient Greece with a seeing eye boy that literally would hold his hand and walk him from city to city, where he would then tell stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey to captivated audiences, right? Of course he's telling it because nobody knows how to read or write during this time period, but these two stories do become a major, major influence on Greek society and culture going forward, right? The Iliad and the Odyssey become the basis of modern Greek storytelling and the basis of many myths going forward later on, right? Now, Homer's stories are also a part of this thing known as the Trojan epic cycle, right? So looking at the Trojan epic cycle, all of his stories focus around the Trojan War, right? And the Trojan War starts off with the Iliad. It talks about Menelaus and Achilles invading and destroying ancient Troy. Then it goes to the Odyssey, which is about Odysseus, who's trying to find his way home from ancient Troy, right? And then later on, the Aeneid, which was written over 1,000 years later by the Romans, talks about the downfall of them and downfall of Troy and then the eventual founding of ancient Rome, right? So as you can see, his story that focuses around the Trojan War does become a majorly important era and a majorly important event going forward, right? However, around 700 BC, writing is going to come back, right? We're going to see trade return. We're going to see new city-states being formed. We're going to see all of this in the wake of the growth of the wake of the destruction of the Mycenaeans and in the wake of the Dorian resettlement of ancient Greece. The Olympics are going to begin. Greece, as you've heard of it before, is going to start up. And we're entering into the Archaic period, right? And the Archaic period is defined as the rise of Athens and Greece under Athens and Sparta, right? The rise of ancient Greece under Athens and Sparta. And ironically enough, the word archaic means old or of ancient use, but this period establishes everything ancient that you know about Greece, that most people know about ancient Greece today. And it's such an impactful time period that we see the influence of the Archaic period all over our current modern day country. The University of Michigan State, or Michigan State University Spartans, is literally their actual mascot. There's a city in Georgia named directly after ancient Athens. So as you can see, the Archaic period is going to be a massively important time period, and I can't wait to talk to y'all about it in class tomorrow. I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.